So welcome everybody. My name is J.D. Scrimgeour, and I am the chair of the writing committee here at the Salem Athenaeum. And I am excited to have a conversation today with a good friend and a terrific writer, Richard Hoffman, who, helped us recognize his latest book, the collection of essays, remembering the album. So let me read a little bio of Richard, and then we will get started. I'll tell you a little bit of conversation, and a little bit, and we'll leave time for questions at the end. The program's about an hour. So, Richard Hoffman is the author of the memoirs Half the House and Love and Purity, in addition to this collection of essays. He's also written the poetry collection of South Paradise, Gold Star Road, which won the 2006 Darrow Street Press Poetry Prize, and the 2008 Sheila Mountain Award from the New England Poetry Club. That was for Congress. And most recently, Until Night, which won the Master's Book Award for poetry. I've gone through all your accolades here. So, a fiction writer as well. His Interference and Other Stories was published in 2009. He's a former chair of Penn and a senior writer in residence emeritus at Emerson College. So this collection of essays from the last 30 years charts very personal journeys, family, aging, but also I think is a graph of our country's recent history. Like we read James Baldwin to experience the 1950s and 1960s and gain perspective on it, I think people reading these essays in the future will understand where we are or where we are now as a country. For those of us reading these today, they enable us to better see this country we live in and to think about how we might address what ails us. I've become good friends with Richard, especially since he moved to Salem in 2016, and he's become a trusted reader and friend and someone I'm always learning from. And maybe to finish this long-winded introduction, I will just read a little poem that I wrote to him, and a kind of mini portrait. When the music takes him, he hollers approval. He likes my poems enough, so I keep writing. And we mustn't forget his reminder about our place. Professors bitch about their workload while they're killing poets in Iran. So I feel like that captures a lot of things that I appreciate about Richard: his enthusiasm for art, for music, and his sense of righteousness and perspective, and his support for my own writing. Let's get started. And I thought we might start by having you talk a little bit about the title of the book, Remembering the Alchemists. And yeah, and maybe we'll have you read from that essay.
Okay, welcome everybody. Was that me? And thanks for coming out on this horrible winter day. Did we make the right choice last week or what? So anyway, thank you all for being here. Well, the title "Remembering the Alchemists" comes from a poem by the late, recently late Charles Simic. And it's an old poem that is called "Poem Without a Title." I say to the lead, why did you let yourself be cast into a bullet? Have you forgotten the alchemists? Have you given up hope in turning into gold? Nobody answers. Lead, bullet, with names such as these, the sleep is deep and long. Now, that essay, Remembering the Alchemists, is about gun violence, but it moves from gun violence on a playground in Boston. Actually, it moves from imagined gun violence in my 50s boyhood, trying to be the fastest draw in the neighborhood with my cap down. It moves to talk about the fact that we're supported, all of us in this room, by an economy that runs on being, among other things, primarily on being the foremost arms dealer in the world and keeping wars going around the globe. And it traces the history of that to an industrialist who was many times over a war criminal from the First World War right through the Second World War, and created essentially the global arms industry. Also founded British Petroleum. Also covered all his crimes by getting himself a chair at Oxford because he could buy and sell leaders all over the world. So that's drawing connections from the very personal and local to the larger superstructure of violence, and examines what values allow that to happen, or what abandonment of our values allows that to happen. So that's about that essay.
I think it would be great to have you read from that essay, that section that we talked about, maybe on 222.
Yeah.
And this is really, to me, you start personally and use your own experiences as a way into this subject. So go for it.
Well, yeah, it's the second short section of this essay. I've been trying to recall the first time I heard the word bullet. I have a snapshot of myself at age 3 or 4, aiming a toy pistol at the camera. Probably my father was taking the picture. Ow, 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 I would have said, not having mastered yet the a cappella imitations of gunfire that accompanied our make-believe combat. We didn't yet have a television to watch the cowboys shoot at the Indians, the soldiers shoot at one another, the cops shoot at the bank robbers. So we didn't know yet how a gun really sounded. When we did finally get a TV, I was especially proud of learning to make the sound of a bullet when it ricochets off a rock you're hiding behind. You make a good gunshot sound, lots of spit behind your teeth, and then you add a little whistle at the end. I'm gonna try it. All right. I used to take the foil wrappers from my mother's cigarette packages and roll them into what I meant to be silver bullets for my 6-shooter, because the Lone Ranger used only silver bullets in his Colt 45 so he could stop the bad guys without killing them. Like the virtuous masked man, I didn't want to kill anybody. I only wanted to be a hero, mysterious on a white horse. Bullet is a strange word. I used to picture a little bull in the dark at the beginning of a long tunnel, stomping head down in its stall, waiting to charge into daylight and gore its victim, man, woman, beast, child. But no, the dictionary says it was once spelled ballet, a small round ball, or ball, especially a cannonball. When I was 8 or maybe 9 years old, I had 2 silver 6-shooters, cap pistols that shot red paper rolls of caps that I kept in the holsters of the toy gun belt embossed with cow horns, horses, lariats, and other Western icons. I tied them to my thighs at the bottom because that's what gunfighters did so they could draw quickly. We used to have competitions in my neighborhood to see who was the fastest draw. I learned to twirl my guns before slipping them back in their holsters, sometimes pretending first to blow the smoke from their barrels. Life imitates art. It follows that bad art begets bad lives. It's a safe bet that without the continual refreshment of our fatal ballistic romance, our obsession with guns would long passed away, a relic of pioneer days like the Conestoga wagon and buckskin breeches. But the gun has been front and center in American film and television since we have had film and television. It's product placement, hiding in plain sight, and it ensures bad art because it serves storytellers as the most common and simplistic deus ex machina of all. You're dead. Even worse, justice. And so it moves from bullet to cannonball to.
Great, thanks. Well, we should talk about that passage a little bit, and maybe in particular, this passage begins with, I've been trying to recall the first time I heard the word bullet. And one of the things that we've been in conversation about is how memory seems to work for those of us who write memoir. And so maybe we could stroll into that territory.
Yeah,
and
the remembering part. Leave the alchemy aside.
Yeah. So actually, we talked about breaking the title into the act of remembering and the idea of alchemy. And remembering is part of writing memoir, but there's also this act of we might call it imagination or art.
I would like to imagine that. I'm going to stand by that statement. And actually, there was I can tell you what I mean by it because I wrote about it. You know? Yeah.
Is that 144?
No, it's 242.
Okay.
What we experience is shaped by our imagination, where encounters with unseen forces are interpreted in personal terms, in one mode of language or another. The imagination is a vast realm where myth and music, stories and visions hold sway. Our lives are always interpretations. Consciousness is a profoundly metaphorical drama staged by the imagination. This is how I understand these lines by William Carlos Williams, himself a physician, who wrote in Asphodel, that greeny flower, "Only the imagination is real. I have declared it time without end." In Catholic school, in first grade, we were often reminded by our teacher, Sister Anne Catherine, that we should scooch over and leave half the sculpted wooden seat for our guardian angel. We all obeyed. Not one of us smirked. And I am not smirking now. I happen to think it is a beautiful idea. It was a real comfort to me, a wise, reassuring, and generous gift given to a nervous child. Each of us had our guardian angel, she told us, who knew us long before we were born. I tried to turn my head quick to maybe surprise my angel to see me. Once I even had myself convinced I'd caught a glimpse, just a movement and a light out of the corner of my eye. And so when I explored the experience of being ill, which is what this particular essay is about, I find there's an angel there, an elusive being born in my imagination as a Catholic child. But it isn't necessary to embrace the cartoon angels offered to 6-year-olds any more than it's required to believe a virus is, quote, some kind of bug. It is possible, I am doing it now, to reach into the unseen with questions and a wondering imagination and to follow our intuition, knowing that we are in relation to much that is unseen and unknown, but nevertheless important. There are other places in various essays where I'm talking about the difference between the biological life and the autobiographical life. We live in the latter. There's a place in, can I just jump?
Go for it.
Essay, which is really an essay where I'm entertaining mentality.
While you're looking, no, keep looking. I just want to say that one of the really interesting things about that essay, Head of a Pin, is that Richard starts, like all good personal essayists, developing a very intuitive and unusual, surprising connection between viruses and angels. And the idea that, well, there's a lot of ideas. I don't explicate the whole essay.
There was a whole taxonomy of angels that almost rivals virology, which is a very new discipline, and it's what actually has, out of that comes, among other things, the vaccines for the coronavirus, which are mRNA vaccines, and that has to do with playing with the RNA, sending phages, which are beneficent viruses, to do certain things to the genes so that they can't allow themselves to be taken over by the virus that wants them as a host. It's really interesting stuff. But the more you read about it, the more, I was also reading this book on angelology, don't ask me why. And the parallels were stunning. But the parallel, like everybody has an immune system that is only yours, belongs to your genetic makeup. And it is interacting with the virosphere all the time, for good and ill. And so the viruses become what Augustine said angels were, the gardeners of humanity. And they're actually steering evolution. So anyway, this is all heady stuff about it was all about being sick and wondering what the hell was that, because the doctors didn't have an answer. And so yeah, I'll read this from a different essay. I guess I'm a hypochondriac. Am I a hypochondriac?
I was wondering.
No, there's two essays in here about being ill. I wasn't worried about what my body would do with this intruder lurking in my bowels. My body would fight as it had been trained to do by eons of evolution. It would either win or lose against its opponent. It knew what to do, and I would make sure that it had the best medical allies in that contest. No, my mind would be the arena in which I had to fight, where defeat would mean despair and meaninglessness and misery. I began to see that my parents and teachers, my culture and religious training had afforded me multiple perspectives, taught me to plead my case for meaning on multiple grounds, to embrace various premises, as if I'd been given a wide shelf of books to take down and read from as needed. The books didn't need to agree. They only needed, each of them, to suffice for the moment. I felt grateful for this insulation from terror and madness. I felt well equipped. So it's that idea that, what we call our lives is our experience, which is not only subjective, but imagined. We imagine it. People make a strong distinction between imagination and memory, and I think that's a terrible mistake. And that is not permission to make things up when you say something is nonfiction. But if I'm remembering the last time we met at Guru, I'm remembering the sandwich I ate and the coffee, and it has all these different aspects to that memory, but it's all imagination. It's not, I'm not there, I'm conjuring it. So memory is one kind of imagination. Anyway, that.
Can I ask a question as a fellow nonfiction writer and memoirs? How do you deal with the question of when you are making connections, when you're using what you would call your imagination to, I think of it often as juxtaposing certain memories as you describe them with others. Those are personal choices. And even, for example, the way that you are connecting viruses with angels. I mean, there's something there, but there's also Richard Hoffman there.
And there's the accident of reading Elliot Weinberger's book of essays about angelology, just because I love that writer, not because I was even interested in that subject.
You're right.
But reading that during the time of the pandemic, being afraid that I had COVID when I was really sick, it didn't turn out to be COVID. That's a confluence of a lot of accidents too. So
yeah, and I think actually that's sort of where my question was going, which is how do you know when you should trust the accidents? Part of the pleasure of writing personal essays is that you can make the essays meander and take turns that just kind of intrigue you. But my inclination is to say, well, and that's always going to pay off. But I kind of wonder if there are moments when you just say, this is just too much play, too much. Are you following this?
Yeah. I guess I'm trying to get what I need from a writing project, say, or a poem. I need something, and I don't know what it is. And bringing things together, if they come together in a way, it's like, yes, that's what I need, and it lands. That's a truth for a moment. It might not have any staying power. But for that moment, it's what is it? Frost says, a momentary stay against
confusion.
And I'm confused a lot, so I write all the time because, yeah.
That makes it feel very personal, and yet I wonder also about you have passages in here about the role of art and the role of memoir, and it doesn't seem like it's about being therapeutic necessarily for you, even though you just said you think it is.
To an extent, I mean, let me read something like that, if you don't mind. That's the thing about writing is you work really hard to articulate something, and you always, I think, you always do it better when you have time and space to sit down and figure out what it is you're really trying to say. Let me find this. It's in the essay Backtalk and Backlash.
So there's the part on 144 about sustained questioning. There's a paragraph, and then actually the one I had mentioned to you was the memoirs that I cherish are those that were to name those silences. On one. Oh, I'm sorry. We have a strange idea that the truth is simple on 151.
Yeah. Well, all right. I'll read 2 paragraphs from this. This is a memoir is a representation of the author's encounter with memory. It is a compromise with the demands of narrative and of that medium we call a book. It is less a record of the past than the record of sustained questioning, a reflective authorial inquiry. Although a memoirist agrees, or certainly should, to respect the facts as they can be known and not to deliberately change them, the memoir is not a photo, it is more a drawing or a painting or a poem, necessarily impressionistic, subjective. In other words, it is art. I think a lot of the contention around the genre of memoir comes from people coming to it expecting that its primary value is documentary. And many times that's not the case.
Could I read a paragraph of yours?
Geez.
Just a little later in that essay, I really like this, and this is something I think I would be reading to my students down the road. We have a strange idea that the truth is simple, that it is something you blurt out. No artist or scientist would ever agree with that formulation. The truth is always something you arrive at after painstaking investigation, and the truth of our own lives is no exception. The memoir is governed by a radical honesty that accepts the facts as they are known and as they may be further discovered in the process of remembering, researching, and writing. Writing doesn't come from knowing. Knowing comes from writing. Writing comes from unknowing. I especially like that last sentence. So, I hope we're not getting too heady for you out there. So, it's what time? How are we doing that? It's 4:30. We could stop and take a few questions and then come back and have more of a conversation. Do you want to, or what do you think?
We could do that. We could continue to talk about the personal and the political, the larger
Sure, let's do that.
world.
Okay, yeah.
And if you start with the personal, and you start with memories that won't let you go, and you wonder why, and you probe it, and you get in there and say, well, how if I understand this moment, I may understand something about where I am in history. What forces have been at work in my upbringing and in my life since then, and the changes that I've been through, and all of that, focused on certain memories that just won't quit. There are a number of places where I'm talking about a memory that is like a knot in the net of me. Like it's something that is irreducible and will not go away. There's one section like that where I'm making, you had it marked.
Page 42, yeah. You actually could, if you wanted to read a little bit of this, I really love this passage where Richard is pulling out some memories of his time with his mother, in part because there's a moment a little after this where you say after 6 or 7, you don't have as many memories, and you sort of attribute that to a time when you stopped being a child and became this thing called a boy.
Right.
So the essay is partly about how gender sort of shapes your relationships and your relationship to the world.
Yeah.
But yeah, do you want to read just that little section on 42?
Sure.
You could even, I don't know, I drew pictures, maybe.
I drew pictures. She encouraged me to write stories to accompany them. What does the bunny say? Say the bunny says in a squeaky voice, her nose wriggling, I want a carrot. I want a carrot. And she lettered that in the dialogue balloon above the bunny I'd drawn and colored with my brown crayon. From then on, she would only have to point to the words for me to read them. I want a carrot. Until one day I was reading them. And she brought me the drawings she had saved in her sewing box, and we stitched them together into books we would show my father when he got home from work. Together we would make a little man and a little woman of leftover pie dough and toothpicks and bake them in the oven with cinnamon sugar and butter. While we waited for our people to bake, we ate tomato soup and toast. In the spring, we would harvest the dandelions in the backyard. The scissors I used to cut them were plastic and fashioned to look like a giraffe. The nostalgia I feel writing this for childhood, for being cared for, doted upon by a loving mother is not the point. But neither is it entirely beside the point. It is a way into memory, the swinging open of a gate to a beckoning, peaceful place, like one of those idyllic city parks we stroll in, which, of course, happens also to be a cemetery.
There's so much to like about that, and what I also like is the movement of the mind in this, from those astonishing details. I don't know if you were as touched by as I was, of just the scissor shape like the giraffe and the simplicity of the tomato soup and toast. That paragraph was
Well,
nostalgic to me, and I wasn't even there. So, but then you check yourself in a certain way, and well, what is the purpose of this act that I'm doing in remembering?
well, I was trying to find my mother in that essay because I lost her. Not only did she die when she was 56, but I lost her very early because of what you mentioned. I was a child until the age of 7. And then I was a boy. I belonged to my dad and my uncles, and my mom stayed in the kitchen. This was the classic arrangement, right? And I lost her, and I never really got back what was lost. And so those memories take on this incredible power in my, because they're all I have to conjure with. We're talking about bringing images together and trying to make connections. That's what that, in that particular essay, I'm trying to connect enough of the memories that I have to make some sort of constellation that brings her, at least in outline, back to me. I'm going to read you about my very first memory, which is in that essay.
Can we say the title of this essay? It's An Egg.
An egg. An egg. But I won't tell you why it's called that. If you read it, then it's sort of a punchline. I was uptown with my mother. I remember a trolley car, which makes this a very early memory because I was born in 1949, and the last trolley on Hamilton Street ceased carrying passengers to the offices and department stores up and down that wide boulevard in 1952. I believe this is my very first memory, this one bright, noisy moment of screeches and sparks and ringing bells that somehow made it through my toddler's trance to become not only the first of my memories, but the beginning of memory itself. What I have from time to time carelessly called my life, and which I now just call my story. Falling sparks, blue and buzzing, and white sparks shooting out from screeching metal wheels, and people getting on and off, unconcerned by fear or wonder. And amid the shrieking of wheels on steel, a bell, ding, 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 and the gray and white behemoth shudders and lurches forward into a day in winter. Yes, I remember snow when I was 3. We may have gone uptown to pay the electric bill because another incident I associate with that day is a sickening vertigo when looking up at the towering Pennsylvania Power and Light Building. I looked up and up and up through the falling snow until my stomach flipped and I became dizzy, and I thought the angels were pulling me up to heaven, but I didn't want to go. I know this because my mother once told me that right before I fainted, falling to the sidewalk and peeing my pants, I yelled, "No!" So that's a very early memory. And it's interesting because we talked about this earlier. The book is a miscellany of essays from 30 years, but when I sit with it now, and I've been sitting with it trying to prepare for this conversation and putting all these little tabs in it and all that, correspondences and echoes that go back and forth between the essays give me myself. Like I really, I put the book together more or less intuitively and quickly. It's deliberate, but it's deliberate the way if you're writing a poem, you choose a word or a line break, you just make the choice and you keep going. It was like that. But now I'm seeing here are those damn angels again. And they're early in the book, and then they appear in the middle of the book and they appear at the end of it. So if I were to draw arcs back and forth between all those things, you would see the sort of root system of my thinking for 30 years. That's the payoff for me as a writer,
Maybe as a
and
way.
the big bucks,
Yeah. Books are for sale.
Leave apart.
So actually, but maybe as a way to introduce the book a little bit more and mention a couple other essays, do you want to talk a little bit more about the correspondences you were discovering in this book? When you say you were discovering yourself, what is?
Well, yeah. For example, there's an essay, Neighbors, which is probably the earliest one here, from about 30 years ago, and it's about riding the red line from Cambridge into Boston, and it's about looking, and it's about how do we look at one another, in crowded spaces, and what does it feel like to be in those spaces, and what people don't, and I think I'm happy about this. No one has remarked on the fact that there are no cell phones in this essay. I mean, I have an iPod, right, and I'm listening to Thelonious Monk on it, and I'm reading The Idiot by Dostoevsky, and those were just facts of that particular ride that I was exploring in the essay. But when I look at the essay now in its place in the book, I see Mishkin as someone who lives his questions and is considered a fool. And I think of Mishkin as like singing Elvis Costello's what's so funny about peace, love, and understanding, and he's adamant about kindness. And then I talk about Thelonious Monk taking a melody and breaking it apart in all of these pieces and trying to reconstruct it and put it on a different footing and send it off in another direction. And those two things are present in every essay in this book. This sort of sometimes the insistence on kindness as the primary virtue takes the form of outrage, and the deconstruction and reconstruction of the received melody, if you will, of our moment, what's come down to us historically from upstream, that we have to process somehow. We have to fix things. We have to take it apart and put it together in a different way and move in a different direction. Seems to be the task of our historical moment. So they're there in every one of the essays, and I didn't know that. I mean, and that essay is 30 years old. So obviously, I've been thinking the same thing, chasing my tail for all of that time. But that's why I say, the payoff is then I get to see what I've been thinking.
And we get to see it too, which is satisfying for me as a reader. And
So
I think I used the word righteous before, and I think especially as writers, we can be scared of that word.
well, righteousness is a funny thing. If you think you have it, you don't. I mean, if you aspire to it, you might actually get it without knowing it. But if you insist that you have it,
well, I was thinking this isn't about, I guess, righteousness as much as though you used the word outrage too, and I was thinking about the essay, which is very powerful, From the Depths. And do you actually just want to give a little summary of what that essay is about, what probably the wrong word, triggered it, I'm thinking of, well, go ahead. Do you want to just talk about that essay a little bit and the situation?
Well, the situation was once at a 12-step meeting, a man approached me who was completely battered and living on the street and asked me if he could have my phone number. And I said, sure, and you want to get some coffee? And he was just, no, I just want to phone number. So I said, okay. And gradually he warmed up to me, and we had a 2-year relationship as a sponsor and sponsee. Sponsee is a weird word, though. Sounds like a spondee. Is that me? I'm sorry. You did that. Anyway, the situation was he had a kind of relapse. He was mentally ill and had been in and out of the state mental health system for a number of years, but was getting on his feet, and it seemed to me doing really well. And then one day I got the most vile message from him, full of racist rants about my grandchildren who are Black. I let you read that. I don't want to read it out loud. And that's
There was a lot of misogyny in it too.
well, he bet, and homophobia and all kinds of. Just the guy was a very sick person, but it brings me to this point of how many of these things, racism, anti-Semitism, misogyny, how many of them are real illnesses, sicknesses? What is evil? That's where I end up asking that question in that essay. I don't have an answer for it, but he poses the question. He posed it in my own. And so it's another example of moving from the personal outward, or moving to trying to understand how did he become the person he became, and how, more importantly, did I not see it? Because I feel like our whole country just went through that. Where did Nazis suddenly freaking come from? How did we not see that? We're living in a country that was founded on a genocide and rests on an economy built on slavery. And we still don't see what's in front of our noses. And suddenly they all come out of the woodwork, and there they were all this time. And why didn't I see that with this guy? What are the baffles and blind spots that kept that hidden from me? So it moves outward to larger questions about where we are in our historical moment, or where we are because I take up the business of what are we leaving our grandchildren? What kind of ancestors will we be? I'm trying to locate myself, moving from the personal in sort of horizontal time to understanding myself in terms of vertical time or generational time. And where are we all in that? What's come to us? And we're basically, I come to the idea that we're buried under layers and layers of untruth. And we're floundering around in the wake of the most atrocious century humanity's ever had. The war that my father fought in killed 80 million people. And now we're like, well, that's over, and that was, within the lifetime of people in this room. So unless we're willing to look at stuff like that, I don't think we can think clearly about much at all.
I was
That's a
struck.
challenge.
one of the things you're trying to do in this essay is, as you say, is try to understand why you didn't see this, and I thought this was an interesting sentence. Anyway, it's a recognizable dynamic, the reluctance to see malevolence as long as you're getting what you need, the assurance that you are a good person. You felt like you were helping him, and that you are just fine. Thank you very much. And I had written I had written, what makes us need this? And is there an alternative? I mean, there's something to be said for a sense of self-worth, right? But
yeah, but if you're in a position where you're doing things to prove to yourself that you're a good person, you're in trouble. Right?
keep going, or?
Well, I mean, that's it.
Yeah.
I think that's it. I think, then, so you have something to prove, and you have to prove it to yourself, and that I think we're in psychological trouble at that point. That's my humble opinion.
Why don't we briefly touch on seabirds and then open this up for questions, or do you want to read?
Yeah, well, Seabirds is an essay about Salem, so you should definitely.
Yeah. And I like it because I make a little cameo.
They live to tell the tale. That's the amazing part of this.
Just barely. So Richard said he purchased a boat, and I'm not a boater myself, but even when I saw the boat, I knew this was going to be trouble. And it took us a long time just to back it down the ramp into the water, and it was just, again, I'm not a boater, but it was small.
Hey, you know what? That essay will take me 12 minutes to read. 12 minutes, I'll read the essay.
We could do that, and then maybe take just a few questions or wrap it up. Yeah, we could come in. Yeah.
So it's called Seabirds, and you're not the only one who makes a cameo in this essay. Who's in the room? Kathy's here, and Judith Nyes is over there. And I have mentioned that a friend who used to live in Salem. Well, you'll hear it. It's called Seabirds, and begins with an epigraph from Leonardo da Vinci. If you look at walls covered with many stains with the idea of imagining some scene, you will see in it a similarity to landscapes adorned with mountains, rivers, rocks, trees, plains, broad valleys, and hills of all kinds. You may also see in it battles and figures with lively gestures and strange faces and costumes and an infinity of things which you can reduce to separate and complex forms. And with these walls, it is as with the sound of bells. In their ringing, you may find all the sounds and words that you may wish to imagine. I don't think you can stay in that frame of mind very long. But anyway, I was 18 when I first saw the ocean. I stood on the boardwalk in Ocean City, New Jersey, and nodded at the Atlantic. It looked as I'd imagined. The boardwalk smelled of suntan lotion and French fries. 3 years later, as a college student, I signed on to an oceanographic research voyage as a summer job. We spent 2 weeks off the Grand Banks before heading for Iceland, where I was too sick to get off the ship. I never really got my sea legs. When I wasn't ill, I was queasy with the fumes from the ship's engines. The USS Josiah Willard Gibbs was a converted seaplane tender, not a large craft, with a lab aboard run jointly by Bell Labs and the US Navy. The research had to do with underwater sound. My badge said I was a navigator, which only meant that below decks, I sat in front of a Loran sea machine that displayed the ship's coordinates. The entire expanse of the ocean is a machine-read electronic grid. Every 15 minutes, I would check our Loran sea against our last position on a chart, that showed our planned course as a blue line. If we were far off, I'd use a compass and protractor to measure how far and radio the bridge. Simple, boring, smelly with fumes. I have two distinct memories from those weeks at sea. The first is a storm that brought waves of 25 to 30 feet, which feels like going in and like being in an elevator, going up 2 floors and then down 2 floors and then up 2 floors over and over. My stomach remembers that one. The other was a clear night of stars that helped me understand the word firmament. More stars than the spaces between them. The sky, something firm, not mere space, and much more substantial than the day's pellucid cerulean. I brought only one book with me, Hamlet's Mill by Giorgio de Santillana and Herta von Dechen, a dense hardcover tome with a beautiful image on its cover, a great tree, Axis Mundi, breaking through the crust of Earth's orb and branching to connect a scattering of stars. I'd been reading Jung since my psychology class the previous semester, and one evening around a hookah, stoned with friends on a braided rug, I began enthusing about the collective unconscious, especially about all the instances of syncretic myths and tales across cultures and continents. It seemed so promising to me to think that we possess one species-large consciousness. I was, after all, at a Catholic university, steeped in the idea of a body of Christ of which we are the members, and more than a little desperate for evidence that the war-torn and apocalyptic world of 1969 could be somehow understood. One of the circle, who I remember well and gratefully, but not, sadly, his name, interrupted me. He protested that there was no need to come up with such a quasi-religious explanation. We're all looking at the same sky, man. Those are sailor stories. They're about stars and planets and weather and water, man. Then he put the hose to his mouth, burbled a hit, and passed it to the person next to him. Hamlet's Mill, he said, exhaling smoke. That's the book to read. That book is out of sight, man. Aboard ship, I read and reread the book when I was not on watch. I couldn't entirely follow its convoluted argument. I kept being hijacked by my enthusiasm for some myth or another from one place or another on the globe. Still, my stoned friend was pretty much on the money. The myths we know, according to the authors, are the tales of seafarers, merchants, essential to the development of cities, and were meant to communicate astronomical observations in narrative form for navigational and geopositioning purposes. I remember standing at the rail, awed not only by the sweep of the Milky Way, but also by the brilliance of those long gone artist astronomers. I spent a long time above decks that night. As the waves picked up, I watched the flying fish, schools of them, leaping from wave to wave. Later, the bosun explained to me that they only appear to fly, that they swim in a straight line just under the surface, the movement of the waves exposing them at intervals. When I moved here to Salem, Massachusetts, a historic seaport, I was 68 years old, and the soggy, wet bottom of the country had just given way. Donald Trump had become the 45th president of the United States. Just around that time, I read somewhere that Thoreau said he loved the Atlantic shore because there all of America was behind him. That seemed about right to me even then, back when we thought America could not be more outrageous, cruel, and violent, back before we'd ever heard of COVID-19 or had to endure the stupidity and callousness and selfishness of our leaders while nearly 1 million of us died. I moped around for the whole first year. I had to drive into Boston 3 days a week to teach, and driving back to Salem always made me sad. I had lived in Cambridge 30 years and I missed my life. I had the good sense to complain to a friend that I was low. She had grown up in Salem. All right, Margaret. I won't get into it. You need to develop a relationship to the water, she said. Perhaps it was a failure of the imagination, but I decided I should therefore buy a boat. When I shared this with my wife, her ancient aboriginal ancestral sigh left no doubt that she wanted the idea. But it turned out that friends of ours had a little wooden skiff they built themselves, a beautiful 12-footer for sale, with a 5-horsepower Mercury outboard, complete with trailer. They delivered it to the backyard, where it sat for a good while until one day I decided, damn it, now or never. With a new Salem friend, also a writer, I trailered the boat to the launch. It took, I think, 17 attempts to back the trailer down the ramp and into the water. At one point, I jackknifed completely into an L. I looked from my driver's window, and there, beside me, was my boat. By the time I succeeded, an amused crowd of mariners, including the harbor master and the coast guard, had gathered, shaking their heads. I took the boat out on the water a total of 4 times that summer, enough to learn it was too small. 2 adults would have it riding so low in the water that if you gripped the gunwale, your fingers would skim the surface. It felt like sitting on a sheet of plywood on the ocean. And even boats that were trying to be careful would capsize us if I didn't remain alert and steer whoop, 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 directly across the wake while gunning the engine. Since then, the boat rests on its trailer in the yard, covered completely in a sagging tarp that is filled with rainwater and become an extremely popular bird bath. Starlings, sparrows, jays, mourning doves, and cardinals gather in my neighbor's scraggly tree or bounce on long lawns of forsythia, making a racket while they wait their turn. These days I walk or ride my bike half a mile to Salem Willows Park. The water on my left, Collins Cove, opens into the broader harbor just beyond Dead Horse Beach. I've heard the story of that funky name in several versions, that a dead horse was found there, washed ashore and stinking, or that it was the site of a burial ground for farm animals, or my favorite, that this was the place appointed for bringing dead horses, some peculiarity of the tides here, perfect for gathering up those offerings and carrying them out through the harbor, past the islands, into the open sea. I can't vouch for that version, however, but I like it too much not to let it be. Soon there are grassy areas and picnic tables, the clam shack, the ancient willows and oaks and sycamores that the park is named for, a honky-tonk strip of takeout restaurants, pizza, Chinese food, soft serve ice cream, and the best popcorn in the world returned in a giant metal drum, old school at E.W. Hobbs, served in red and white striped boxes. I continue on, park my bike, sit on a bench, and watch lobster boats, motorboats, and sailboats making their way into or out of the harbor, and the Boston Ferry, and the schooner Fame out of Pickering Wharf. It reminds me of the west coast of Ireland. My favorite spot juts out into the harbor as far as you can go on land. There are 3 benches there, each with a dedicatory plaque. Edward and Dolores Zielinski, champions for family, Salem, and the Willows, best parents and best popcorn. What a story unfolds from this one. You can sit down and look out past the Misery Islands into a fog just beginning to roll into the harbor and wonder at 3 generations of Zielinskis. That last line tells me that the donors of this bench were, while strictly speaking anonymous, Edward and Dolores' children. And I can think of only one explanation for best popcorn, and that would involve a young grandchild equally anonymous. And what do you remember best about Bobka and Gigi? And what about Teddy and Gina Jaworski, always reminiscing and wishing, married in Italy, September 26, 1948. Reminiscing about what? Wishing for what? But shall we read that as remembering Italy, of which we were back there? I hear a sigh in the way it's phrased. Can we infer that Tadeusz, was an Allied soldier stationed in post-World War II Italy? Gina, a war orphan, a martyred partisan's daughter, a hanged fascista? I'm stretching, I know, but the past is foggy, made of distance and plausibility. There are dead horses in it, I think, and immigrants' dreams, and sailors telling stories about the stars, and shipwrecks, and Italy, and untold other things to reminisce about or wish for. Even the simplest and most conventional of the three, the loving memory of Carol A. Ghiberti, offers much more to read than the words. I find myself staring at it while questions swell and break one after the other, engendered, it seems, by the water and salt air. This mental state, a reorientation, a reminding that happens, is a kind of ionization of the imagination. Soon things take on significance, one way or another, metaphorical, allegorical, associational, consequential. It may be just a brackish whiff of what those earliest seafarers experienced under the strewn and clustered stars. I'm going to skip to the end. I discover in the essay that in order to continue to be interested, I start taking pictures. But that's because someone said this is what happens to photographers. You take pictures and then it makes you more present to the. That didn't happen for me. And I kept waiting for it to happen. But then I started taking photographs, taking them home and using them as prompts for watercolors. And that was a whole other world, because at that point, those places entered my imagination in the process of doing that with watercolors. So I'll just read the last couple of paragraphs. Watercolor, it turns out, is my relationship to water. Sometimes, with or without a photo to prompt me, I start by drawing a line and staring at it until I see it as a horizon. Then I put something below the line, a post, a tree, a boxy little house, anything, just to establish perspective, to add dimension to the flatness, to suggest a matrix on which other objects are to be distributed. But it is important to paint, not merely draw and color it in. As a landscape or seascape emerges from the paper, I sometimes see that it comes close to a real place that I know, that memory serves up. And I put in one or two more details that would suggest the place to anyone who's been there. Once, when I had used a light cardstock, not watercolor paper, the supersaturated paper left behind a few specks of erupted pulp when it dried, darkened, raised crumbs as if from an eraser. They were in the area just above the horizon and seemed to me configured as distant seabirds wheeling in fog. I reached for a pencil to trace them, maybe to claim them, to insist on them, but it was time to step away. It's important to know when to step away. So,
And beautiful essay, beautiful book. Can we take a few questions before we wrap up?
can I say one thing?
Oh, sure.
There was a different and longer ending on that essay until J.D. said, hey, that's where it stops, man. Come right there. And so I owe that to Councilor Scrimgeour.
Professor. Any questions? Sure.
I'm not from Salem, I live in Marblehead, but I've never heard of Dead Horse Cove.
Dead Horse Beach.
Where is it?
Dead Horse Beach.
Dead Horse Beach, can you tell me where that is?
Yes.
Is it Collins Cove?
Yeah, take Memorial Drive. And as if you're going out to the Willows
Right,
and with the water on your left. Just when you get to where the parking lots begin on your right,
Yeah,
My new left is dead horse feet.
It's basically
Oh,
at the
okay.
Willows, yeah.
I
Yeah.
never heard that, that's interesting.
There's a sign.
Does anybody know the truth about why it's called dead horse feet?
Just that that was in there, that's all, that's what I heard, so I've heard various versions.
Yeah.
I like my mythical version of dead horse.
You too.
Getting all the way out to the. Two.
Well,
How to say it.
I just to tell you, I grew up in Mint and then Swamps.
Okay.
Say for you about includes Salem.
Yes,
Yeah.
well, that's why I thought you were so acculturated too.
Yes, so you were.
Right.
Well, this is, my question is really about if you pay attention to how you make connections. And your essay about Paula Vogel and the play Learning How to Drive. I saw the play, it was a little uncomfortable. I read the reviews. I would never have been able to put together the essay that you did.
Mhm.
So I just, maybe your process, tell us a little bit how you.
I think that's a really great question. That was his, the play How I Learned to Drive is about the abuse of the young girl by her uncle. And there's a moment in it when it's clear to me the playwright doesn't know where to go with the story, because she has the young girl after her uncle dies yelling to him in heaven or wherever he is. She says that she wishes he would find one young girl who could give herself to him entirely, as she could not. And she said, and she says, who did it to you? Were you 10 when they did it to you? And as a survivor of childhood violence, sexual violence, and a male survivor of childhood sexual violence, the canard that men who were sexually assaulted as children grow up to be child molesters has no place in the American theater, has no place in the culture at all. It's a simplistic misunderstanding of a larger phenomenon. And you'd have to have lived that and know that. So I felt a little bit like someone from an unrepresented group having a story told about them that has costs, that has real consequences, and no voice. And so I needed to talk back to it. I know men all over the world now, since my first book was published, who are heroes, who are fighting on behalf of children, who are starting organizations and institutions and all the rest of this, and trying to bring awareness to the fact that children, both boys and girls, are abused in this horribly misogynist and patriarchal arrangement, whether you're talking about the Taliban and their dancing boys, or whether you're talking about the Catholic Church and their ongoing onslaught on children, native children, children in the aftermath of wars and famines, etc. All of this, I know too many men who are heroes to abide that kind of bullshit. You know, that it turns out there is absolutely no statistical or clinical evidence to that. It's a simple, to those to whom evil is done, do evil in return. Well, if that was true, there's no room for agency in anybody's lives. You're completely the product of what happened to you. And so, yeah, I let my anger out in that essay, but tried to explain better than I am right now, the reality and how egregious that canard is. And she was just using it. And I've seen it before. I've seen it in Dennis Lehane's work. In what was it? Gone Baby Gone. You know, where it turns out at the end, the guy that they got everybody suspecting because they all know he was abused, isn't, after they kill him, they realize, oh, it wasn't him. But it does still, the whole book, the whole story rests on the idea that people think that. So anyway, I didn't mean to get on, you know, any kind of homily there, but yeah, that word outrage applies there.
Peter?
Jim had a question.
Oh, sorry. Way back to the beginning of your discussion of armament in this country, is there any chance at all, do you think, that they'll ever be romanticized the gun in America? And if so, how? Or is it just not even for discussion?
No, I don't see it because I just was in Wyoming for a month at a residency, and I've not been to the West since I was like 20 and doing a hippie road trip thing. I didn't really notice much because I was stoned all the time. And but I really got to understand that it's a different culture. It's almost a different country, and I understand their response to the NRA's whipping them into hysteria about people coming to take their guns. Everyone I knew there, or everyone I met there that month, had a gun on their truck. You had to have one because you're going to hit animals all the time, and you're going to be able to put the animal down that you just hit. That's what most of those guns are for. And then you go into the saddle store, and there's all these beautiful hand-tooled saddles everywhere and guns all over the walls that are a reminder that is their history. It's very different from an urban Northeast history. It's a different culture. And I don't, there's no reason anybody should have an AR-15 or an AK-40. That's nonsense, but the hysteria has taken root there. The slippery slope theory, I think that, if you're given that our assault weapons, they'll be back here for our shotguns.
I think one more question and we'll wrap it up, Peter. It's like
Peter.
Hey, so the From the Depths essay is very strong, and I was very glad that you had the Wheels essay before it leading into, because we meet your grandson, and I wanted you to talk about more about what you learned from him and your other grandkid.
Oh, well, I guess I learned even in parenting over a period of time that I don't think that I think kids are learners, and they're going to learn, and so it's a question of protecting them more than trying to teach them this, that, or the other thing. Protect them and they'll be all right. I mean, that's your job as an adult, as a parent, keep them safe. That becomes harder and harder to do. And it terrifies me now that boy in that essay, who's 8 years old in the essay, is now a teenager. Very proud of his little mustache that's coming in,
Yeah.
but he's 6 feet tall. He's a 6 foot tall black kid. So it's terrifying, yeah. Boy, I can't begin to talk about, I haven't really scratched the surface yet, and it's something I'm trying to write about now. The whole business of grandparenting is a different ontological status. It's not just, there's something very different, and you get to watch personhood happen. in a way that you don't have the leisure to see when you're apparently trying to pack the lunch and, drive here or there. So, yeah, there's a lot to learn. I haven't really parsed that all out.
But you're hopeful.
Yeah, well, yeah. It's bound to happen.
Well. Thanks to those of you watching in Zoom land, thanks to the Athenaeum Director Jean Marie Purchase and Carolyn McGuire for their assistance in putting this together. Thanks again for coming, and hope to see you at the reception. Take care. Hold on.